we're recording. Good. So if you don't want your face to be seen, you can turn off your video, but it will be available to look at afterwards if you miss something. I'm delighted to see each of you here this evening. I am Phil Coonley of 33 Lloyd Street in Winchester, where I've lived for 46 years. I'm a past president of the Winchester Multicultural Network that became the Network for Social Justice in 2019. I'm now chair of the network's Immigrant Justice Committee that was formed then. Sorry. Now. The Immigrant Justice Committee advocates for policies to promote the safety and inclusion of all immigrant residents, workers, and visitors to Winchester. This over. Okay. Cutting off part of the slide, aren't I? Anyway. There are 6 active immigrant justice members, including Sandy Thompson, Dennis Brett, Wei Han, Bob Dickinson, and Beth Nolan. And we have the support of the network staff, board, and steering committee, and typically also seek and gain other organizations as partners in our initiatives. Our 2021-22 agenda is right here. It's not what we're going to be talking about tonight, except a couple will be referenced, but it gives you an idea that we have a lot of educational and advocacy activity going on, not just this one. When it comes to the background for tonight's meeting about local voting for all legal residents, including non-US citizens, there are 3 noteworthy decision points from an IGC perspective. I'm going to try to put each in context. The first decision point was the Select Board's amendment of the town's Human Rights Statement in May 2020. And for those who don't remember what this looks like, and I'll read it because most of you can, I guess. If I can move this over a little more. The main thing that was exciting for us is we've been working on the Safe Community Act. Then the police chief retired soon after COVID hit, and when it hit, you may remember it was a sad part of it all. Was not just a disease, but there was scapegoating of especially Asian immigrants, and it caused us to shift our focus away from the Safe Community Act. Though 40% of the caretakers of COVID patients and of senior people were immigrants in Massachusetts, and were most exposed to the COVID infection in the course of their work, many of these caregivers were being disparaged or worse. Neither legal residency nor long-time citizenships was protection from harassment. We were thus very pleased when the Select Board responded to our request to amend the town's Human Rights Statement by adding country of origin and immigration status as categories of people to be respected and protected in the enjoyment, in their exercise of human and civil rights. The next big decision point for us was the Select Board's February 2021 support for adding an article for the town meeting consideration that would support expansion of local voting to legal residents who are not US citizens. Here's the background on that. As we explored how we might realize the promise of the amended Human Rights Statement, we were most impressed by learning of Arlington's 2019 town meeting, in which its members overwhelmingly voted in favor of non-citizen legal resident local voting. We met with the initiator, Ben Rudick, who told us how startled he was to learn that many of his most established neighbors could not sign his town meeting member nominating papers because they were not registered voters, and that they could not be registered voters only because they weren't US citizens, and that they wished that wasn't so. He was surprised, so he looked into it, and I'm going to use his words here because they're pretty moving. My radical progressive idea to allow non-citizens to vote in their local elections was neither radical nor progressive. In fact, it's a reversion to an earlier time in our country when non-citizen voting was widespread. These are still his words. To quote the Harvard Political Review, as a general matter, suffrage rights evolved to become more inclusive, but there is at least one group that, since the beginning of the 20th century, has lost the franchise in American elections: non-citizens. Once commonly accepted in the United States, non-citizen voting has been extinct since Arkansas became the last state to ban it in 1926. There are a few exceptions to that extinction, as we'll learn later. In fact, I could only find one other group who had their voting rights curtailed: African Americans in the South after the Civil War. Even the Japanese, interred during World War II, retained the right to vote. As far as I know, non-citizens are the only group who had the vote, lost it, and never regained it. What happened? Broadly speaking, a wave of anti-immigrant sentiment flooded our country in the late 19th and early 20th century that was exacerbated by World War I. States, one by one, outlawed non-citizen voting. By the election of 1928, this trend was complete. As noted by political scientist Leon Ellsworth, that was the first election in over 100 years in which non-citizens couldn't vote in any federal, state, or local election. That ends Ben's words. We researched the issue and confirmed Ben's findings. We were encouraged by a survey among the Chinese American network of Winchester that found out almost all of those surveyed would like local voting extended to legal residents, not yet US citizens. And we spoke with Senator Jason Lewis, who told us that while mass legislator bills favoring such a change in state policy had so far had little support, a key way to gain such support would be for more towns to emulate Arlington's request for the state's approval. With this encouragement, we reached out to the select board. And again, we were immediately encouraged to pursue passage of a similar town meeting article, ideally when governance issues were a town meeting theme. The third key decision for the Immigrant Justice Committee in pursuing this matter was the League of Women Voters of Winchester's decision last June to partner with us. Susan Fredicchio will now fill you in on the League's decision, which ultimately led to my being included in many informative meetings with Margaret Edelman, the active Vermont League member, speaking later tonight. Because we've been working this issue for about 18 months, we have heard or read many arguments for and against allowing non-US citizens to vote locally. If any of these have still not been addressed by our upcoming speakers, I would be happy to address them briefly during the Q&A. Susan?
Thanks, Phil. And I want to thank everybody who is joining us. I see people are still joining and signing on. I know there are a number of other meetings this evening, and I really appreciate everybody taking their time to come to this one. I've been a League member I'm sitting here trying to think how many years, maybe 20, and a League member here in the Winchester League of Women Voters. And my mother before me was a member of the League of Women Voters in our town when I was growing up. And civic engagement, which means the active, informed participation by town residents in town decision-making, is one of the core parts of the League's mission, as well as greater voting participation. And as Phil mentioned, the League got involved because last year Phil presented this concept to the League's annual meeting, when all of the members try to attend. If they can't attend other things, everybody tries to attend the annual meeting, which I think is in the late spring, maybe May. And they heard about this from Phil's presentation and were very intrigued and interested and wanted to get involved. And so the steering committee took this up when planning this year's activities by the League, and also Maryland, I believe, reached out and did some research with leagues in other states in the region, and got together and really learned a lot from Vermont. And that's what she's going to cover this evening for us. And we're really grateful. The League is a great resource for us to learn about what's going on in other states. So I'll turn it over to Marilyn.
Thank you, Susan. So tonight, Leora, if you could put up my slides, that would be great.
Yep, just give me a sec and I will do just that.
Great. So I'm going to really be talking about this concept of non-citizen voting in Winchester and this citizens petition that will actually be voted on at this spring's town meeting. So first, I also want to welcome everyone attending. I hope we have a lot of town meeting members here as well, because this educational forum brought to you by the Network for Social Justice and the League of Women Voters, I hope will be very informative and help you form your decision on terms of how you will vote. First slide. So why expand the franchise? Well, as Susan indicated, the League has historically had a core mission of registering new voters. It's been involved in ensuring there's an informed and educated citizenry, and we do that through our debates and forums like this. And historically, we've also moved to expand the franchise whenever we can. So if we look at history, in the 1700s, only male property owners over 21 could vote. After that, some of the suffragettes moved and worked to grant former slaves the ability to vote. The 15th Amendment granted African-American men the right to vote, and it was passed by Congress in 1869 and ratified in 1870. The 14th Amendment gave them citizenship, but not the right to vote. What happened here locally in Massachusetts in 1879, women were allowed to vote for local school committee. And the notion was that women were responsible for raising children, and why shouldn't they know and be more involved with the school committee and who's on it. In 1920, with the passage of the 19th Amendment, women were finally allowed to vote, and the League of Women Voters was born. In 1971, 18-year-olds also were allowed to vote. And this is an area where, again, the League pushed for this amendment to pass. So if we look at the background, and Phil's alluded to this and touched on it, the practice of non-citizen voting was actually quite common in local and even state and federal elections. And again, as Phil mentioned, so for 150 years, non-citizens could vote, but the last state, the final state to end it was Arkansas in 1926. Next slide. Why expand the franchise here in Winchester? Well, these are some of the reasons. There are many more, but I'm just going to cover a half dozen. So first of all, non-citizen legal residents own property, they pay taxes, their kids go to school, they contribute to the community in all kinds of ways, join many organizations. They are affected by the policies and actions of local government, just as citizens are, and they should have a voice. You know, this country was founded on taxation without representation, and that certainly applies here. It's also would be a sign of respect to welcome the input of newcomers and decisions that impact them. And one thing we've learned in studies that have been done is that children that accompany their parents into the voting booth are highly likely to vote when they become of age. It just becomes a habit. One thing that's missing from this slide, but the slides will be shared on the League website and the network website after this, and it'll be updated with this piece of information that didn't get put on by mistake. So there are actually 1,277 adult foreign-born non-US citizens living in Winchester, and that's according to the latest Census Bureau data. So this is not a trivial number of people. 1,277. Next slide, please. So if town meeting members vote yes, what happens next? So Winchester would file a home rule petition, and then it goes to the state legislator and the governor for approval. if they approve it, then we enact the language that is in the article. And that was shown at the beginning of this program tonight. It's also been broadly shared. Again, this will be posted on our websites. Non-citizen legal residents, and that's residents that have green cards or work visas, would be allowed to vote in Winchester's town election. They would not be able to vote in any statewide or federal election, however. The town charter would then also allow registered non-citizen legal residents to run for elected office at the local level. Now, this state process will take time. Other cities and towns over the years have passed ordinances that have just frankly stalled in the state legislature, but it does feel like the tide is turning. More legislators have indicated that they would vote yes. The city of Boston is exploring this. That would be huge. So we'll see what happens, but I guess we're optimistically hopeful. And one final note here is that undocumented immigrants would not be allowed to vote. It's only non-citizen legal residents. Next slide. And finally, what would implementation look like? So it's possibly or probable that the town clerk would have a separate registration form and voter rolls for these non-citizen legal residents. It's possible that ballots could be in other languages, and we'll be learning more about that after my presentation when we hear from Marguerite Adelman from the Vermont League of Women Voters with a success story. Instructions and procedures would definitely come from the Secretary of the Commonwealth as well that would guide us. And this is something else that we will put on our website. It might be in the chat, but I'm not certain of that. We have a memorandum from our town clerk, Mary Ellen Landon, that talks about some of these implementation issues and the guidance that would be needed from the Secretary of the Commonwealth. So now I'm going to pass this on to Marguerite Adelman. Phil and I have been meeting with her pretty regularly and learning more about Winooski. And Marguerite, all yours.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here tonight to talk about my community, which is Winooski, Vermont, which did pass and approve what we call all resident voting here in our community. If you could put my slides up, I'd appreciate it. And I'll take you through those. So this is a picture of my community here, Winooski, Vermont. We're on the Winooski River, right next to Burlington, Vermont. While the League of Women Voters in Vermont did not participate directly in getting all resident voting in Winooski, as a resident of Winooski, I'm very familiar with the process they went through. And here in Vermont, 2 different communities approved all resident voting. My community, Winooski, is one. The other is the state capital, Montpelier, the second. Next slide, please. So I think it's important just to point out that federal law prohibits voting to non-citizens in federal elections only, which means that, what is in a state constitution and whether that state has home rule or not is often what dictates what happens at the state and the local level. Next slide. So currently, no state constitution in the country includes a right for non-citizens to vote, which is what makes this process a little more cumbersome and longer for some of us if we are interested in moving in that direction. Next slide. And I just want to point out that currently 5 states have included a ban for non-citizen voting. They are Arizona, North Dakota, Colorado, Florida, and Alabama. And more states currently are also considering the ban. Georgia was one, but the Senate voted it down. Wisconsin is also considering a ban. I think a lot of this has to do with the this last election and quote unquote the big lie and the idea that a lot of individuals voted fraudulently. So we're seeing some political ramifications in this whole area. Next slide. So challenges to non-citizen voting. Municipalities can expand their voting rights in local election, especially if there isn't anything in the Constitution that would forbid it, the state constitution. And especially if local jurisdictions have the power of home rule. Massachusetts, for example, has home rule. Vermont didn't or does not have home rule. So our process was probably a little longer. Next slide. So I want to tell you about Winooski's journey to all resident voting. Winooski is located in Chittenden County, and it's part of the Burlington metropolitan area. You know, the largest population areas right around and in Chittenden County. Winooski is also the most diverse community in Vermont and in our region of the United States. We are a refugee resettlement community. And in our school district, for example, 20 languages are spoken. So it is quite a diverse community on every single level. We're actually an old mill town. You can tell the building behind the kids in that picture is one of the old mills. Next slide. So these are some facts about our community. We're certainly not as big as you all are. Basically, Winooski is a little over 1 square mile, literally. Those are our boundaries. Our population is 6,131. 82% of our population are native US citizens, 8% are naturalized citizens, and about 10% or 618 are not US citizens, but legal residents. We're not the richest community in Vermont by any means, and we have one of the higher levels of poverty in the state. Next slide. The whole issue of non-citizen all resident voting really began with our charter commission, and over 3 years ago. There was a lot of strategic planning done in the community, and just like you, we had a statement about who we wanted to be that was meant to be welcoming and inclusive, and to invite new people to participate. And so that discussion began 3 years ago, and the city council asked the charter commission to present Winooski voters with a charter change that would enable all residents to vote in Winooski municipal elections, would protect Winooski voter information, and would align the charter of the city and the school so that there was more compatibility between the two. Next slide. So the process in Vermont started with our charter commission, as you can see there, and they held a number of community meetings, gathering public input and feedback from community members. And then the council actually put the question, very similar to your question, on the ballot. And then we had our local election and people voted on it. And if it was yes, then it was. It had to go to the House and to the Senate. So both our House and our Senate had to vote to approve the change. And after that, it had to go to the governor. And then finally, if he approved it, it came back for all resident voting. So I'll tell you what actually happened here in the next slide. So, well, actually, no, I'm going to go back a bit. This is who we allowed to vote, okay, in all resident voting. So residents who were here under a federally sanctioned legal category and who will be 18 years of age or older on election day. They had to reside in Winooski with the intent to stay, which is the exact same rule for any other voter. Qualified Winooski residents could vote in all local elections, the school, and the city. They can run for public office. And the city will maintain a state and a federal voter registration list But both lists have to be available upon request. Next slide. So when this went to the polls and the question came up, the charter vote in Winooski was 2,479 for all resident voting and 999 against it. And that was in November 2020. The charter changes were approved by both the Vermont House and the Vermont Senate, but the governor vetoed the charter changes, saying that it was unfair to have different voting rules in different communities. The House and the Senate actually overrode the governor's veto. And we then ended up having, obviously, non-citizen all resident voting here in Winooski and Montpelier. On the other hand, we also had lawsuits filed. The GOP filed state and national level lawsuits against both Winooski and Montpelier. The lawsuit was actually just recently dropped against Montpelier, and I think we're still waiting to find out about Winooski. But since everything was done legally and above board, we're not expecting any real issues. Another political repercussion was that in our recent town meeting day, 3 of the 7 candidates who were running for city council in March of this year wanted to undo all resident voting or impose a mandate on the number of immigrants allowed into Winooski. But all 3 of those candidates lost by huge margins. I think the point is that there was some repercussions politically to this, but the community has stood strong in support of all citizen voting. Next slide. So we spent a lot of time in our community because we pride ourselves on diversity and inclusion. We were one of the first to hire a diversity and inclusion outreach coordinator. We worked diligently to reach out to non-citizens in our community. The best restaurants and so many of our businesses are actually run by legal residents, but not citizens, and who pay taxes and are involved in our schools. So as an effort to include that population, materials and ballots were translated into 8 of the most common languages spoken in our school district. Community presentations with translators were held for non-citizens. Short videos were prepared to help residents, non-citizens understand the voting process. And outreach was done to the various community associations for non-citizens. For example, our largest one is the Association of Africans Living in Vermont. Next slide. So at our first election, which was March 1st of this year, with non-citizen voting, which is just our local election, so it's not one of those big federal ones. The total number of registered voters we have is 5,218, but the total number of people who voted on March 1st was only 938. The total number of non-citizens that we were able to register to vote was 54, and on election day, 17 of those non-citizens actually voted. Next slide. I think for us, what was most gratifying was the sense of inclusion that non-citizens, all residents had in our community, and the sense of pride. We're celebrating our 100th anniversary this year. The Bhutanese fellow who's pictured here was so proud to vote, and so many of the individuals who came that day to actually vote were so pleased. We had huge participation in our community outreach to the various communities. And I think for us, it has reaffirmed the belief in how we perceive our communities. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much for that. And now it is our pleasure to welcome Jonathan Kahn from Progressive Mass. As soon as I find you, I will highlight you for the screen. And I believe, Jonathan, that you brought your own presentation as well.
Okay, just let me know when to screen share.
You are good to go. Welcome.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for kind of just discussing this topic, which is an important one. And like thinking about how we can engage more people in the democratic process is always an important one. So I put together. My name is Jonathan Cohn. I'm the policy director for Progressive Massachusetts. We're a statewide grassroots kind of multi-issue advocacy group focused on. Can folks just, if you're not muted, here's mute to avoid feedback. Okay, that focused on issues of shared prosperity, racial and social justice, kind of strong democracy and environmental protection and sustainable infrastructure. I put together some slides. Some of this will be kind of going over things others have said and then bringing it down to the Massachusetts context as well. So again, as others have noted, the case for non-citizen, or as last week noted, also all resident voting. Okay, thank you. Okay, you can hear me now.
Yeah.
The simple principle of no taxation without representation, immigrant populations, or let's say like the non-citizen immigrant populations in Massachusetts will kind of pay taxes, right? If you work here, you will be paying taxes here. And so they contribute to our local budgets and our state budgets, but can have no say in deciding how those budgets are actually spent or kind of are allocated. And the simple democratic principle that we should want our electorate to be as reflective of the population as possible, as well as the people who vote to be as reflective of that as well. Just thinking of, since we're just coming out of a redistricting process, you saw that a lot when redistricting talked about voting age population as well as citizen voting age population. And there are certain municipalities in Massachusetts where the demographics of the citizen population and the resident population are actually quite different. And that becomes a problem in talking about making sure that you actually have reflective governance when there's a clear divide there. That I think, as another speaker noted, that non-citizen parent involvement in school affairs can increase students' academic performance, right? That many people who are non-citizens have children in schools and school systems around the Commonwealth, and making sure that they feel like they're a part of that school community that voting in school board elections can bring is important. And that voting and civic engagement, as you all well know, are ways of integrating new community members and strengthening the whole community. We know that for those who are citizens, and it's true for those who are not citizens, especially as a way of welcoming them, getting them engaged, and building the stronger communities that benefit all of us. As some other speakers noted, what's fascinating with these issues of non-citizen or all resident voting is that it's actually a reversion to what used to be the case in the country. That the bans on non-citizen voting are fairly recent in our country's history. This graphic shows over time which states actually allowed non-citizen voting. That you can see that it was in the 1920s when the last states finally started banned non-citizen voting. So it was only around 100 years ago when kind of Texas, Arkansas, Missouri, and Indiana stopped allowing that practice. And it's a striking thing to think of when we tend to view, let's say, despite recent rollbacks in voting rights happening around the country, we tend to view it as an arc moving forward in voting rights expansion throughout our country's history. But this was a striking counterexample of that, where over time, those rights were rolled back. And that often, as noted before, having to do with waves of anti-immigrant sentiment throughout US history, with the rollback happening in New England, which was one of the first parts of the country to roll back those rights, occurring during the wave of Irish and German immigration in the early 19th century, as well as kind of certain fear of the foreign born coming out of the War of 1812. And then kind of the later states to eliminate it, again, had to do with waves of immigration, like that late 19th century, early 20th century wave of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe that led to this no longer being the case. What's interesting to note with Massachusetts is that in the Massachusetts Constitution, when it back in 1780, made no reference to citizenship as a requirement for voting. There were obviously the many restrictive and problematic restrictions on voting in there, as we know from our nation's history around race and around gender and around back then property ownership, but citizenship was not a requirement. And kind of Congress in the early years of the country actively promoted non-citizen voting. As I noted before, there was waves of kind of nativism that led to those rollbacks, including Massachusetts ending voting rights for non-citizens in 1822, 200 years ago, shortly after Connecticut had before. And then back when Massachusetts at that time was definitely a kind of a hotbed of nativism in the country, you had the Know Nothing Party, which had a majority in the legislature, embedded a ban into the Constitution in 1854, and even banned foreign-born citizens from voting 2 years after naturalization back then. It shows kind of the milieu in which that was coming about. Although with looking at the issue in general in US law, that non-citizen voting in local elections is allowed if kind of authorized by state law. That, as speakers noted before, non-citizens are not able to vote in federal elections or state elections, but there's explicit allowance for local elections. And one good principle to keep in mind as well is how kind of the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, applies to non-citizens as well, especially with that school connection around education. It applies to children like non-citizens and their children of that kind of right to an education. And it's good to bring that principle over to voting rights as well. One good quote I found as well from Jamie Raskin, who's now a congressman from Maryland, back in '93, was about the current blanket exclusion of non-citizens from the ballot is neither constitutionally required nor historically normal. And the kind of non-citizen voting in federal elections only was explicitly made criminal in 1996. So that itself is a fairly recent bit in the nation's history, even though by the 20s, states had no longer allowed it. But you do have this kind of in practice in other parts of the country. Chicago, since 1988, has had non-citizen voting in school board elections. And San Francisco, back in 2016, passed a measure to allow non-citizens with school-age children to vote in school board elections. It exists in 10 different towns in Maryland, often in kind of the DC suburbs, places like Tacoma Park, right outside of the city. And folks might have been or probably following back late last year into the beginning of this year, New York City became the newest addition for allowing non-citizen voting, allowing kind of all kind of say legal non-citizens, like green card holders, kind of et cetera, to be able to vote. And even this is for New York City as well, a reversion to what had once been the case, since back kind of up until the 1960s. They would be able to vote, non-citizens could vote in school board elections. It was just then that the school board went from being an elected body to an appointed body, and everybody lost the right to vote in their school board elections, thus leading to the limitation there. Washington, DC has tried a number of times, but unsurprisingly has faced congressional roadblocks to allowing this. And then here in Massachusetts, there have been a number of home rule petitions that have gone up to the legislature. Cambridge did back in 2004. I think I believe Amherst did before the June 2017. I could find the text of that one, but they're described as having done so earlier in articles that I've read. But Newton did so back in 2007, Brookline in 2010. Wayland did so a few years ago, same for Amherst, and Somerville did so last year, filing resolutions. It's also been considered in other municipalities, like in Boston, where I'm joining you from, where I know our new mayor, Michelle Wu, has been on record supporting allowing non-citizens to vote in local elections. And if I'm not mistaken, a majority of our city council support it. It just needs to actually be taken up, which is its own set, which is the two parts of it. You need the support and then you need it to actually be on the docket. And it's been discussed in Chelsea recent years. I know Council President Damali Vido has been a strong supporter of that. As you can see, it's been kind of on the radar of the state legislature for about 2 decades now. Although, as you all might be aware, of the state legislature is dominated by inertia. And one thing that would be especially useful for moving this forward is passing enabling legislation at the state level. The bill in the current session, S465, H770, an act extending voting rights in municipal elections to non-citizen voters of the Commonwealth, would establish that any municipality that wants to do this can do so without requiring state action. You have the double-edged sword of home rule is that it allows municipalities to do things, but you end up needing the state to allow you to do it, and have to then work it through the state legislature. But if we can achieve kind of actually that enabling legislation at the state level, it makes the process much easier, since all that would need to happen would be that one local vote. And as I know one speaker noted earlier, having more municipalities pass such home rule petitions helps build the momentum for passing the enabling legislation, since that kind of puts it more on their radar and creates a pressure for them not to want to have to deal with things piece by piece, and actually just allow municipalities to expand the franchise. Something those municipal expansions of the franchise have also been talked about for other voting issues, such as lowering the municipal voting age to 16 to allow 16 and 17-year-olds to vote, as cities and towns have been talking about, or even the push to allow municipalities to kind of opt in for ranked choice voting on the municipal level. That last year, the kind of support for non-citizen voting was adopted into the Massachusetts Democratic Party platform for the first time, which was kind of a big step forward. I was part of the group in the platform committee pushing for that to happen, and helped write the language that allowed it to pass during one debate. But that's and especially a point for accountability as well. For language that is in the Democratic Party platform could be used for accountability for Democratic office holders. And since we do have this year a kind of the Secretary of State elections, this year can also be an opportunity to talk about that as an issue, as talking to candidates about what they're doing to engage more voters and strengthen rights in Massachusetts. There was a great article recently from Mark Elias in the Democracy Docket about how deep blue states should be setting the bar higher for what voting rights look like in the country. That as we're seeing voting rights roll back in some states, it shouldn't just be focused on keeping things as they are, that those kind of deep blue states need to be kind of setting that bar higher and expanding rights, as Massachusetts isn't even the leader on voting rights as we often think that we are. Just put in the text of that bill at the state level, as again, as noted before, focuses on kind of non-citizens with legal status, let's say green card holders, could also be students who have kind of authorization to be here, and focus, that's noted as well, on specifically on municipal elections. And that would require as well certain activity from the Secretary of State, so that you can have a separate voting registration form for non-citizens. Obviously, they, again, can't vote in federal elections, and that needs to be stated, kind of stated clearly in this, but it's something that for other cities have been able to do this and have pulled it off successfully. And what we should want to be limiting the barriers to the franchise, so that we can put our focus on the work of actually getting people to show up to the polls and educating them about what's on the ballot, which take up enough of our time to begin with. This is, again, as I noted before, as the issue is becoming more salient in Boston, And it's especially like in Massachusetts as a whole, since Massachusetts' immigrant population has been growing. Currently it's about 1/6 of Massachusetts is foreign born, with about half of that population having arrived just since 2000. And of that 1/6 that's foreign born, about half of them are naturalized citizens, but the other half are not. And on that simple principle, if there are more people that can be brought into the democratic process, we all benefit from having more voices at the table who are able to weigh in and have important perspectives and life experiences. Just quickly as well about the issues around non-citizen voting in other places around the world. There are 22 democracies that grant some form of non-citizen voting. The constitutions of Bolivia and Colombia explicitly allow non-citizen voting in local elections. And then in the EU, if you're a citizen of any EU member state residing in another member state, you have the right to vote in local elections in that state. And kind of again, just showing like this is something that the like bureaucracy and implementation doesn't need to be a barrier, because you can learn from best practices of what's done elsewhere. And then my last slide was just putting together some other articles that are good ones highlighting some information, as well as I read a chapter from that book. If you're interested in diving in, from the chapter that I read of Ronald Haydock's book, Democracy for All, Restoring Immigrant Voting Rights in the US, it's well worth a read.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was great. And we'll make sure that is your slide deck available for us to send out as well with the resources?
Yes, would be happy to share it.
Okay, that's so great. Thank you so much. And it is my pleasure to invite the last speakers for tonight to share some personal stories about their experience and relationship to this issue. Lei Chang is going to join us. I'm just adding spotlights to everyone. And Wei Han is also going to be part of this conversation.
Well, actually, I'm going to speak first, I think, and then I will introduce Lei.
Yes, I brought you both in there.
Okay, all right. Hi. Good evening. Hi, my name is Wei Han. Some of you may know me from town meeting or other board committees in Winchester. And tonight, for the very first time, I would like to share some of my own personal experience as a Chinese American immigrant. So hopefully that will give you some ideas what they are going through, and based on my interactions and connections with non-citizen residents in the town of Winchester, and hopefully that you have a better idea who they are and what they're facing, and why we want to have them to participate in our local elections. So I was born and raised in Beijing, China, and came to the US 30 years ago in 1992. I moved to Winchester in 2003. And before becoming a US citizen in 2006, I went through the working visa green card steps that took about 10 years. I was lucky, and the process went pretty smoothly. And I know that many people, took a lot longer than that. So I registered to vote immediately after becoming a US citizen, but only voted in 2008 presidential election. At that time, I had no idea about town elections. I heard about the select board, at that time it's called Board of Selectmen, and planning board, town meetings. I had no idea what those meetings or committees mean and what they're doing. So in 2012, I started my involvement and volunteer activities, first at Winchester School of Chinese Culture. I connected with a lot of Winchester families, a lot of immigrant families there. And I actually created and run the parent association at Chinese school. And today, I still volunteer there, even though my children no longer attending the school. So over the years, I started learning more about the concept of self-governing by residents in the towns in New England, and the concept of engaging civic duty. It was an eye-opening experience for me. So eventually I found out that not only I could vote, but also become a candidate in town elections. So in 2013, I ran and become the first Chinese American town meeting member, and I start spreading the words about what I learned at the meetings. So as more Asian and Chinese families moving into our town in the last decade, especially last few years, many of them were like me, trying to find ways to participate and contribute to the community. But they didn't know where to start. So in 2016, I co-founded the Chinese American Network of Winchester, aimed to enhance neighborhood integration and strengthen engagement in community affairs. Many of these immigrant residents, although they were not citizens, but demonstrated strong interest to participate in town affairs. So some of them, read the budget books with me together before the town meetings, discuss the warrants and talk about, candidates, in town elections. So many of, school, zoning and budget issues have direct impacts to their lives and to their families, but they have no real say on them. They pay all the taxes, but their voice cannot be heard, in elections or on ballot questions. Vote is the most powerful tool in a democratic society. We are at the birthplace of the taxation without representation. So according to the last 2020 census, there are at least 15% Asian Americans in the town of Winchester, and a majority of them are Chinese Americans. Because of my involvement with the Chinese American community, so I personally know many of these families. I know that vast majority of these non-citizen residents are green card holders, aka permanent residents, and they share many similarities. First of all, most of them have advanced degrees, master or PhD degrees. They were educated and trained at the graduate schools in the US. They speak, write, understand English very well. I mean, they had to go through stringent exams in English in order to attend schools here and receive their postgraduate degrees. Secondly, they all own properties. They pay all taxes: car excise taxes, income tax, property tax, social security, Medicare, everything. And also that is on their top of mind. They discuss about their tax and water bills, a lot. They pay attention to these things. And also, and thirdly, they all have school-age children. They're very involved, with the schools and student activities, and pay very close attention to education issues. I can think of two examples. One was like 10 years ago when my daughter was at kindergarten at Lynch Elementary School. I attended one of the parent training for computer class assistants. So it was I think it was a Tuesday morning. I showed up there. I was surprised to find that 7 out of 9 parents in that training were Chinese American residents. And I happen to know all of them. And they were all green card holders, except for me. And they all had full-time jobs. And they just took a few hours off their work, attend this training, and then plan to become the lab assistants for the rest of the school year, for that class, for the computer classes. So, and another example, a more recent example, was like 2 weeks ago, and there was a message sent out from a Winchester soccer club, ask all the families to join the Springfield cleanup on a windy Saturday morning. And when I showed up on the Leonard Field, I was seeing many young Chinese families up there. And there are several of them I knew personally, and they were green card holders, family members. So, and another thing I want to mention about these similarities about these green card holders, that vast majority of them are independent. They have different political views on different issues, and they openly discuss about issues. And people debate about them, and a lot of people debate with me. So when I walk around the town, during election times, I saw that some people put rival candidates, in their front yards, so that they all have their own opinions. I really don't. I mean, for allowing these non-citizen residents to vote It's not intended to change any elections, or change any particular elections. This is simply an effort to build a more inclusive community, to have a voice in our local issues, which they pay very close attention and very eager to participate. And just at the end, I want to give a face to all these, people that I just mentioned and interact with. It's my friend, Dr. Lei Chang. Lei has a PhD in biology, and it's just like many Chinese American residents here. They have advanced degrees, and he worked in the pharmaceutical industry. He's very involved in our communities, and not only contributed to a Winchester community, but also contribute significantly to a scientific and medical world. And most recently, his work in the last few years contributed to a COVID-19 test, and that is helping a lot of people. So without further ado, here's Lei. Lei, you need to unmute.
Welcome, you're muted.
Yeah, can you hear me? I think I'm on mute now. So yeah, thanks, Wei. And actually, listen to everyone talk about this issue. I think I learned a few things new and never know, like in American history, a long while ago, it was actually allowed for non-citizen to vote, and it's only recently it has been blocked. So to introduce myself, my name is Lei Chen, and I am a scientist and the director in a biotech company. I'm a green card holder for a few years now. So I think I'm here just trying to put a live example, like who are those people they are demanding for right to vote locally, and like what kind of weird aliens are they really? So I, with my family, came to Winchester in 2008. So first rented for about just a little bit over a year, and then we bought our first house on Highland Ave and lived there since then for almost 13 years now. So we have 2 kids, and the 2 kids had been raised here, and they went through the Winchester public school system. The girl has goes through 12 years, K-12, and she's in college now. The boy is a junior in Winchester High. So recall the time when I came here. I think I fell in love with this town, probably at the first sight. So far, all I can recall is good memories. I feel like it's inclusive, welcoming town to me. Whether we look at those little cute downtown area, or the pretty waterfront, well, out of my door, the beautiful scenic fells. So all of those is calling me, this is a beautiful community. But most of all, what impressed me was the people. So those kind neighbors, those knowledgeable and enthusiastic people around me. It's pandemic, but I really miss the block party we had every year since I moved here. From the first year I moved here, and every year. All those delicious dishes we had from each neighbors is just make me drooling when I think about it. Hopefully we can do that again. We can Zoom that again this summer. So myself, I have been involved in quite some community activities. With 2 kids growing up, it's easy. So I become a soccer dad. So I coached both my son and my daughter's town team throughout the years, probably 8 years. So it's really a great time with the boys and the girls, like have them just running on the field, yelling at them. It's one of the legal time you can yell at them. So sometimes, even now, they were quit. They have quit town soccer a long time ago, but even now, I see some like young guys, met them occasionally and taller than me on the street, and suddenly I realized, oh, this is like a little boy who played soccer. This shy little boy played soccer on the field back then. It's really rewarding. So other things I do, I would love to do more, but no, there's some things I can, some things I cannot. So some things I'm doing right now is I volunteered in Winchester Chinese Culture School. I was a teacher since 5 years ago there to teach Chinese. So that's myself, but I think I think a lot of people, at least I know several of them, are in a situation like me in Winchester. So we have been living in town for years, raised kids here, and just a few blocks down the road to me, I have two families, friends live there. So we moved here like within maybe a couple of years difference time. So our kids are similar age, so they play together and we become friends too. One of the family has a UK dad and American mom. Another family has a German dad and a Russian mom. So when we get together, it's fun. It's like the kids do play dates and we were just chatting around. It's like a little international conference. Of course, that we talk about world peace, right? But more likely we are talking about things in our daily life. Saying, hey, which kid get what teacher, which teacher, and how lucky. So the next door neighbor who bought the house at the bottom. I know like they all like me, care about the town. They want to be part of it. Like for the past years, some of them has naturalized and some of them are still green card holder. So 13 years in this town, but I have been asked some questions, say, hey, you have been here so long and were you thinking about being a citizen, or why haven't you? Although I think this question is not really relevant to what we are discussing here. There's probably multiple reasons and everyone has its reason for me, but I'm willing to share my story. I don't know if everyone knows, do you know how long it's gonna take to get a green card legally, say based on employment here? So in my case, it takes many years. So it took me 7 years after I came here and worked in the US. So my journey is probably an average case. I know someone like spend even longer time. So during that time, you probably have to work for the same employer because it's employment based, and there's all kinds of reference or forms or kind of letters you have to write. So it's a long and painful process. After you get green card, you have to wait for 5 years to be a green card holder before you can legally apply for American citizenship. So that's 5 plus 7 average, let's say. And once you start the application for citizenship, it typically takes 1 or 2 years to get approved. That's the timeline before the pandemic. Of course, it's getting longer now. Everything is getting longer. So luckily, my wife, who, we get here together, and she got her citizenship like right before the pandemic. So I think in my case, like 13 years is probably the at least required time to get the citizenship. I would say there's probably a lot of laws in the US, but 2 laws are pretty complicated, the most complicated laws. One is the immigration laws, and another is obviously tax laws. So I'm unlucky right now. At this moment, I have to deal with both at the same times now. Hopefully, you got your text down. So, but one thing is pretty simple and clear. According to the tax law, I am treated 100% resident as soon as I step on this ground and moved here. So in every federal, state, or town level. So during the years I being a citizen, I being a resident in Winchester, to be honest, at the beginning, I were probably not really involved much in the town election in early times. So years passed. It's impossible to not notice it or think about it, like how our school system is doing. Should we increase the tax to improve school system? Can we have a viable downtown, or maybe where we should put the low-income housing, or how many we should build for the low-income house? All those questions is attractive to me. So recently we had a town election. I was pretty involved in there, although I couldn't vote, but I support people. And it's actually great to see the higher turnout rate. It's still in probably middle to low 20s, but it's great to see all kinds of voice were represented there. When my neighbor who is up for running for planning board member, or maybe the mom of one of our soccer team kid served as a school council member, or maybe the mom of my son's best friend who served as the select woman. I think I really appreciate their contribution, dedication. Maybe a lot of those town meeting member or committee member are here in today's meeting, and just like you, I think you guys contribute time, energy, and a lot of them more spend within the community to make the community better. I just want to say maybe thank you, and hopefully, with the efforts we all have, I was able to support you directly and maybe even join you in the near future.
Thank you so much, Lei. That was great. Thank you, Wei, as well, for sharing your stories with us. I'm going to remove the spotlight on both of you as we move to questions, and we do have some questions. I'm wondering if one of the other co-hosts could possibly remove the spotlight on Wei, just so he can be off the hot seat quite literally. And we do have a few questions in the chat. So one question.
Since I'm at the spotlight, let me answer a couple questions since
Great.
I know them pretty well. That regard to why some green card holders are not becoming a citizen. In addition to you have the 5-year waiting period, and there for the residents that I contact with that have been in Winchester more than a decade and still holding their green card. Family was one reason. Some of them are the only child of family, and they have aging and ailing parents in China, for example, that they want to be able to fly back immediately if there's a need. And I was actually trying to encourage them to become citizens, since that there was a 10-year traveling visa start being used a few years back, and some people still hold on to their Chinese passport, and it turned out that they were right, because those traveling visa no longer valid during a pandemic, so that it's almost impossible for any U.S. passport to apply for an emergency visa to visit their parents if they're being hospitalized. So that's one of the reasons, and there are some other reasons that people have different reasons, and also I would say that that there are some people that are like Asian or Chinese Americans in the town. They are actually holding different passports. I know there Canadian, the people holding Canadian passports and Australian passport. There is from I know their family from Malaysia, but they're like a third generation in Australia, and they have been in the Winchester more than 15 years and still are green card. And I think that's a common mentality in European passport holders. They just don't have reasons. They didn't want to, become U.S. citizen, but they enjoy their lives here. They're very involved in our town. They would love to participate in local elections. I asked a lot of them. They said, "Oh wow, if that's possible, they will be there. They will be at the voting booth. First thing. So that's I think many people have different reasons. That's the reasons I gather. Hope that answer a few questions.
Thank you so much, Wei. That was great. I wanted to add before we move into the questions that I am a Canadian by birth, Canadian Israeli. I do run the Network for Social Justice. I have been here. I added it up while folks were chatting and while I was seeing things in the chat. I have been here for 8 years at this point, and I am still not a U.S. citizen. It has just taken a while to get the process going. I didn't get time for my visa when I was a student, as someone said in the chat, and then I waited and waited. And even though I am a Somerville resident and would love to vote in Somerville locally, and I am very involved in Winchester, I do not have the privilege of voting as well as one of those Canadians. I did want to address a few of the questions that were in the chat that I collected. It's a few I don't know the answer to, so I'm hoping some of our panelists can help. Cambridge was the first in Massachusetts to request non-citizen voting. Has there been any progress on Cambridge? I believe Cambridge was 2004. I was wondering, Jonathan, if you could help us with this answer.
Yeah, it's largely been stuck at the legislature since then, is my understanding. The home rule, I don't know if they may have refiled it in subsequent sessions, which I'm not 100% sure of. But it's largely been stuck because of the need for enabling legislation at the state level. And I think that kind of just speaks to the point kind of made by one of the prior speakers, that I had reiterated, as if when more municipalities send home rule petitions on something, it creates that kind of momentum and pressure for the legislature to just pass something that would allow any municipality to take action.
Thank you so much, Jonathan.
It was a good question.
Another question that we had, which I believe we do have the answer to, is what is the % of non-citizens in Winchester right now? Marilyn, would you be able to answer that? Oh, you're on mute. Oh, you're still on mute.
Yep.
There you go.
I actually am hoping Susan can help with that. I don't know that I apologize. I don't know the total population of Winchester, but we can figure it out if someone has that. Susan?
I was only able to share, and I think it was only went to you, the link to the US Census page that I have. I didn't do the math on that particular thing. But I know Winchester's population is around 22,000.
Yeah. Yeah, and I heard that Marilyn mentioned that according to town clerk that there are 1,277 non-citizen residents here, and that I don't know how many of them are 18 years and older, but since we have 22,000 residents total population here, so that's roughly about 5% of Winchester residents. Yeah.
Thanks,
Thank
Wei. Thank you, Wei. The last question we had is, do municipal elections ever overlap with federal and state? And if they overlap, would there be a separate ballot for the municipal ones? I believe the answer is yes, and they rarely overlap.
I do know that, at least in the 30 years that I've been here, that the town election is in March, and there's never an overlap with a state or a presidential, or national level election. Mary Ellen, the town clerk, has talked about maybe trying to do something like that. But right now, the charter is that the town election is in March, and there it never is an overlap. And I think as from Vermont, and just researching this in general, that you would have to have a separate ballot. But if you have a a primary going on. A lot of Winchester voters are unenrolled. They're not enrolled in a political party, but they come to vote in the primary and they have to designate what party they want to vote in. So there are 2 ballots there. So it's, you know, it's something that isn't unheard of to have multiple ballots.
Thank
would
you,
just take-
Susan.
It would just take a little logistical planning. Yep.
And Jonathan, backs you up. If there is an overlap with the special election, there would have to be separate ballots, okay? But that would be very rare, and the special election is already unique for being a special election. So I think that's not, like, the confusion around those would likely not be an issue. I do know that.
I want
yes,
to
go
add
ahead.
that through the immigration process, you know, before becoming a citizen, that there are always a question: did you vote in federal elections? And if you ever did, that's a federal offense, and you know, you're running the risk that you know, to lose all your legal immigration status, you know, if you ever did. So that it's a very clear. This is for local elections only. It's you know, for the town, for the residents. That's you know, we have to keep that way. It's only for local elections.
Oh, there's another really good question, and I think we're going to cut it off after this. How long does someone have to reside in Winchester before being defined as a Winchester resident?
It's my understanding, from talking with our town clerk, Mary Ellen Lannon, I don't think there is any time period. Instead, when someone moves to town and they access any of, like they enroll their children into school or something like that, then they are considered a resident of the town of Winchester. So it's my understanding there is no time limit. They have to be here a year or something like that.
Okay. Thank you, Marilyn. Thank you, everyone. We are over time, and then we're overtime being overtime. So we're really overtime. We really appreciated the questions, though. We appreciated so many folks showing up to find out about this issue. And overall, we also appreciated so much our panelists, both the personal stories and the Massachusetts perspective and the Winchester perspective, and all the work that was done by the League of Women Voters to put this together, and the support of the IJC. It was really great to have you all with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Leora.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Night.
Everybody.
Good night.
Thank you, Marguerite. That was great. I am going to